Elias Roth learned early that certainty was an illusion. He grew up in a household where prayer framed every meal and sacred texts sat on every shelf, yet none of it shielded his family from loss. When the local bank collapsed during his childhood, wiping out his parents' savings overnight, Elias noticed something that faith could not explain away. The church was full on Sunday, but empty on Monday when people needed help. That was the moment numbers began to replace prayer in his mind. Numbers, at least, never pretended to care, they simply told the truth. By his mid-30s, Elias had become one of the most respected private bankers in the world. Governments sought his advice, corporations feared his predictions, and billionaires trusted him with fortunes they would never admit existed. He had an almost supernatural ability to see patterns in chaos, to predict downturns months before they arrived. To Elias, markets were honest systems. They punished illusion and rewarded discipline. Faith, by contrast, seemed built on promises no one audited. Ironically, much of Elias's success came from managing wealth for religious institutions. Churches, mosques, temples, and interfaith foundations all used discrete financial channels to protect donations, fund expansion, and quietly settle scandals. Elias never questioned the morality of it. Money, he believed, was neutral. What intrigued him was how similar their financial behaviors were. Different gods, same balance sheets. Different doctrines, same hunger for stability. One evening, while reviewing consolidated reports from multiple global funds, Elias noticed something unsettling. Several rival religious organizations, some publicly hostile to one another, were drawing from interconnected financial reserves. Donations from one faith were indirectly stabilizing another. Losses in one region were quietly offset by gains elsewhere. It was not divine harmony that held them together, but financial necessity. Belief systems that preached eternal truth were, behind closed doors, behaving like fragile corporations fighting insolvency. Elias began to dig deeper. He requested historical data, obscure transaction records, endowment adjustments labeled as spiritual expenditures. What he found disturbed him. Sudden doctrinal shifts aligned too neatly with economic crises. Moral rules relaxed during recessions. Strict traditions softened when attendance dropped. Even long-standing sins seemed to fluctuate based on donation trends. The realization hit him with unsettling clarity. Belief wasn't only taught, it was managed. For the first time in his life, Elias felt something close to awe, but it wasn't religious. It was structural. Religion, stripped of mystery, resembled a living financial organism adapting, reshaping itself, surviving at all costs. Faith wasn't crumbling because people doubted God. It was bending because institutions feared bankruptcy. The rules people believed were eternal had been quietly renegotiated for centuries. Elias didn't feel anger. He felt curiosity. If faith could be adjusted to survive, then it wasn't sacred, it was strategic. And if belief followed incentives like any other system, then perhaps it could be improved. Perhaps fear-based obedience was not inevitable. Perhaps religion didn't need to be dismantled, only audited. As Elias closed his laptop that night, he understood something dangerous about himself. He wasn't trying to destroy religion. He was tempted to optimize it. And for a man who trusted numbers more than God, that temptation felt less like heresy and more like responsibility. This was the moment the banker stopped observing belief from the outside and began questioning whether the rules of religion had ever been divine at all. Elias Roth had spent his life uncovering hidden structures, but nothing prepared him for what lay behind account 771B, an active vault line buried beneath layers of obsolete code and ceremonial labels. It appeared harmless at first. A legacy fund closed to modern oversight and categorized simply as perpetual donations. Yet the dates stretched back hundreds of years, long before modern banking existed. That alone should have been impossible. Curiosity, Elias knew, was the most dangerous currency of all, but he authorized a deep audit anyway. The deeper he went, the stranger the ledger became. The earliest entries weren't digital at all, but scanned reproductions of handwritten records, translated and standardized over time. Each page bore different symbols, crosses, crescents, stars, unfamiliar markings, yet all followed the same financial logic. Contributions were recorded alongside annotations that referenced moral adjustments, behavioral shifts, and necessary reinterpretations. It wasn't a holy text. It was a manual for survival. As Elias studied the data, a chilling pattern emerged. Periods of famine, war, or economic collapse were always followed by revisions in doctrine. Restrictions loosened when resources thinned. Obligations intensified when institutions needed funding. Acts once condemned became tolerated, then later rebranded as virtuous when they aligned with stability. The ledger documented these changes with ruthless clarity, as if belief itself were being recalibrated like interest rates. What disturbed Elias most was the precision. The adjustments weren't reactive, they were predictive. Leaders had anticipated loss of followers, migration, or rebellion, and altered teachings before collapse occurred. Faith, he realized, had been quietly engineered. What millions believed to be divine revelation was often strategic foresight guided by economics. God did not always speak first. The balance sheet did. Elias began running simulations using modern behavioral models. He fed the historical data into his systems, mapping belief shifts against financial flows. The results were undeniable. Fear-based doctrines spiked during instability. Promises of reward flourished during surplus. Even concepts like forgiveness and punishment followed measurable patterns of economic stress. Religion behaved exactly like a market under pressure. Yet Elias felt no triumph. Instead, he felt an unsettling respect for the architects of belief. They had not been frauds or villains, but survivors. In a chaotic world, they used the tools they had: myth, morality, and money to hold societies together. The tragedy was not that faith had been shaped by economics, but that no one had ever admitted it. That silence troubled Elias more than deception. If people understood how belief had evolved, would they abandon it? Or would they demand something better? The ledger suggested a frightening possibility, that faith itself was elastic, capable of transformation without collapse. The rules people thought were sacred might only be temporary solutions that overstayed their purpose. For the first time, Elias considered belief not as a lie, but as an outdated system in need of redesign. What if religion could be freed from financial survival? What if morality didn't need to depend on fear of punishment or promise of reward? His simulations hinted at something revolutionary. When belief systems removed economic pressure, cooperation increased and conflict decreased. Elias closed the ledger long after midnight, his hands trembling slightly. He had crossed a line from observer to participant. The knowledge he now possessed could destabilize institutions that had stood for millennia or reshape them into something honest. As he shut down his systems, one thought refused to leave him. If faith had always followed money, then whoever controlled the money controlled belief. And for the first time in history, that person might not be a priest, but a banker. Elias Roth did not announce his intentions. He understood too well that belief systems collapsed fastest when confronted directly. Instead, he moved with the quiet precision that had defined his banking career. Through a web of anonymous foundations, educational grants, and humanitarian trusts, Elias began redirecting capital away from traditional religious hierarchies and toward communities willing to try something radically different. There were no temples built, no grand leaders appointed, no sacred symbols to rally behind. Only a framework simple, transparent, and deliberately incomplete. The new doctrine was not presented as a religion. Elias insisted on that distinction. It had no God, no prophet, and no promise of punishment or paradise. Its core principles fit on a single page: shared responsibility, open records, mutual care, and ethical action measured by outcome, not obedience. Contributions were voluntary, publicly tracked, and used solely for tangible needs, education, healthcare, conflict mediation, and local infrastructure. Nothing mystical, nothing hidden. At first, participation was small. A few disillusioned communities, former believers tired of guilt and fear, agreed to experiment. What surprised Elias was not their skepticism, but their relief. Without rigid rituals to perform or authority figures to appease, people began to engage with belief as a practice rather than a command. Meetings resembled town councils more than sermons. Moral discussions were grounded in real consequences instead of ancient threats. For the first time, faith felt practical. Elias monitored everything: donation patterns, social cohesion, conflict rates, productivity, psychological well-being. The numbers spoke clearly. Where fear had once maintained order, transparency now built trust. Without promises of eternal reward, people acted responsibly because they saw immediate impact. Children stayed in school. Healthcare participation increased. Violence dropped. The absence of divine surveillance did not produce chaos, it produced accountability. Word spread, not through preaching, but through results. Neighboring regions noticed improved living conditions and asked how it was achieved. There was no doctrine to convert to, only a system to adopt. Elias deliberately refused to brand it. No name meant no ownership. No ownership meant no hierarchy. The movement spread horizontally, not from a pulpit, but from community to community. That was when the first alarm sounded. Traditional religious institutions noticed something alarming. Donations were declining, especially among younger generations. Attendance dropped not because people lost belief, but because they found meaning elsewhere. Faith leaders dismissed the movement publicly, calling it godless philanthropy or moral relativism. Privately, they studied it with fear. It achieved what they had promised for centuries: unity, purpose, and care, without fear or divine authority. Elias knew this phase would not last. Systems that challenge power are tolerated only until they threaten survival. Interfaith financial councils began tracing the funding routes. Journalists asked questions about anonymous donors. Rumors spread of a shadow figure manipulating belief through money. The irony was bitterly amusing to Elias. They accused him of doing exactly what they had always done, only without pretending it was divine. Still, doubt crept in. Late at night, Elias reviewed the data and questioned his own role. Had he simply replaced priests with algorithms? Was he engineering morality instead of liberating it? The communities thrived, but they thrived within a structure he designed. Control, no matter how benevolent, was still control. Elias made one crucial decision. He began preparing the system for independence, reducing his financial influence, training communities to manage resources collectively, and publishing every rule, model, and assumption openly. If the doctrine survived without him, it would prove something revolutionary. Belief did not need gods, fear, or bankers to endure. The backlash did not arrive as thunder. It came as whispers-closed meetings, sudden editorials, carefully worded condemnations that avoided naming Elias Roth directly. Religious leaders across traditions spoke of moral erosion, soulless systems, and the danger of faith without God. They warned that removing divine authority would unravel civilization itself. Yet beneath the sermons and statements was something far more human: fear. For the first time in centuries, belief was slipping from their hands not through rebellion, but through irrelevance. As the movement spread, interfaith councils convened in emergency sessions. Rivals who had once denounced one another now shared spreadsheets and loss projections. Donation declines were no longer isolated, they were systemic. Younger generations were not rejecting belief, they were rejecting intermediaries. The banker they had begun calling the profane architect had done the unthinkable. He had made faith functional without institutions, and that to them was heresy of the highest order. The media soon joined the storm. Investigative reports accused Elias of social engineering, of playing God with spreadsheets. Headlines painted him as a cold technocrat dismantling sacred traditions for intellectual vanity. Protests erupted outside financial centers and religious landmarks alike. Some demonstrators carried holy symbols, others carried signs demanding transparency from religious institutions themselves. What began as a theological dispute quickly became a cultural fault line. Then came the summons. Elias was invited publicly and ominously to appear before a global interfaith tribunal. The invitation framed itself as dialogue, but the tone carried judgment. Refusal would confirm guilt. Acceptance would risk everything. Elias chose to attend, not out of arrogance, but because silence would allow them to control the narrative. The tribunal hall was grand, designed to inspire humility. Leaders from multiple faiths sat elevated, cloaked in symbols of ancient authority. Cameras broadcast the proceedings worldwide. When Elias spoke, he did not argue theology. He spoke in numbers. He presented charts showing centuries of doctrinal shifts aligned with economic pressure. He revealed financial interdependence between rival faiths. He exposed hidden endowments, tax shelters, and strategic moral reinterpretations. The room fell into stunned silence. The leaders did not deny the data they could not. Instead, they accused Elias of stripping faith of mystery, of reducing the divine to transactions. Elias answered calmly. Mystery had been used to hide fear, and fear had been used to control. He was not attacking belief, he said. He was exposing ownership. The backlash intensified after the tribunal. Some regions erupted in unrest as believers felt betrayed. Others experienced an unexpected calm as transparency replaced suspicion. Faith leaders fractured internally, some demanded reform, others doubled down on authority. Violence flared in places where power felt most threatened, while cooperation flourished where people felt empowered. Elias paid a personal price. Threats became constant. His movements were restricted. His accounts were monitored. He realized then that belief, when threatened, could be more dangerous than any market collapse. He had underestimated the emotional gravity of tradition, the comfort people found in certainty, even when it was constructed. In quiet moments, Elias questioned whether he had gone too far. He had exposed the machinery of faith, but in doing so, he had shaken identities, histories, and hopes. Yet the world could not unsee what had been revealed. The illusion of divine immutability was broken. The backlash, Elias understood, was not the end, it was the transition. Systems resist change violently before they evolve. And as the world stood divided between sacred tradition and transparent belief, one truth became unavoidable. Religion was no longer protected by mystery. It was now accountable. For the first time in his life, Elias Roth felt fear that could not be modeled. Markets could be predicted, institutions exposed, belief systems analyzed, but consequences rooted in human emotion defied equations. The backlash had weakened him not through threats or restrictions, but through doubt. Each night, he stared at the same dashboards that once thrilled him, now searching for reassurance that what he had unleashed was truly better. The warning signs began subtly. In several communities, participation in the new doctrine declined after initial success. Without rituals or symbols, some people felt unanchored. Transparency created accountability, but it also removed comfort. Disagreements lingered longer without a higher authority to end them. Elias noticed a troubling trend in the data. Resilience during crisis was lower than expected. When resources tightened, faith in the system wavered. Then the global financial shock hit. A sudden market collapse triggered by political unrest and climate disaster rippled through the very funding structures Elias had helped design. Though decentralized, the communities still depended on global stability. Donations slowed. Emergency reserves shrank. Traditional religions, hardened by centuries of sacrifice narratives, weathered the shock better. They offered meaning in suffering, something Elias's system had intentionally avoided. The realization cut deeply. By removing fear and promise of transcendence, had he also removed endurance? Elias confronted the possibility that suffering, however manipulated in the past, had served a psychological function. People needed stories larger than survival. His doctrine offered truth, but perhaps not transcendence. Pressure mounted from all sides. Reform-minded faith leaders urged Elias to become the visible face of the movement, to give it a voice, a symbol, a guide. Government suggested formalizing it into a recognized ethical institution. Even communities within the system began asking for leadership. Elias understood the trap immediately. The moment he became a figure of authority, he would recreate the very hierarchy he had tried to dismantle. Late one night, Elias made his most consequential decision. He would remove himself entirely. He released everything. Every algorithm, financial model, historical ledger, governance framework, and predictive tool was published freely online. No patents, no ownership, no control. Anyone could use, modify, or abandon the system. He dissolved his foundations and redistributed remaining assets directly to community trusts with no central oversight. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Some communities fractured without guidance. Others adapted, reshaping the doctrine to fit their cultures. Critics called it irresponsible, even cruel. Supporters called it the ultimate act of faith-trusting humanity without supervision. Elias disappeared from public life. His name faded from headlines as the world struggled to stabilize belief without masters. Some systems failed, others thrived unexpectedly. New rituals emerged organically: songs, gatherings, symbols not dictated by fear but born from shared experience. Belief, it turned out, did not need architects forever. It needed freedom to evolve. In exile from influence, Elias finally understood the cost of playing God. Control, even with good intentions, corrupts meaning. He had nearly replaced one invisible authority with another himself. By stepping away, Elias surrendered certainty. But in that surrender, he gave belief back to those who lived it. And that, he realized, was the only ethical conclusion to his experiment. Years passed before the world fully understood what Elias Roth had done. Without a leader to praise or condemn, history struggled to categorize him. Some textbooks labeled him a disruptor, others a heretic, a few a visionary. Most simply called him a banker who vanished. Yet his absence became his final and most powerful contribution. By removing himself, Elias ensured that no single voice could claim ownership over belief again. Across the globe, the religious landscape transformed unevenly. Some ancient institutions collapsed under the weight of exposed finances and outdated authority. Others survived by reforming, opening their books, loosening rigid doctrines, and returning to service rather than control. Entirely new belief systems emerged, not as centralized religions, but as networks of shared values. They borrowed language from science, philosophy, and tradition, blending meaning with accountability. Faith no longer demanded uniformity. It demanded participation. Communities once part of Elias's experiment evolved in unexpected ways. Some reintroduced ritual not as obligation, but as expression. They sang together, mourned together, and created symbols that reflected their own histories. Others rejected ritual entirely, grounding meaning in action alone. The diversity did not fracture society as critics had predicted. Instead, it reduced conflict. When no belief claimed divine monopoly, disagreement lost its violence. Ironically, belief grew stronger where it was no longer enforced. People questioned openly without fear of punishment. Doubt became a tool, not a sin. Children were taught ethics through consequence and empathy rather than threat. The absence of eternal reward did not make people cruel. It made them present. Meaning was no longer postponed to the afterlife, it was lived. Elias watched all of this from anonymity. He lived simply, far from markets and institutions, reading reports not as forecasts but as stories. Occasionally, he recognized fragments of his old models in new systems, but they were altered, humanized, imperfect. And that imperfection comforted him. It meant the world was no longer optimized, it was alive. One evening, Elias encountered a small gathering in a public square. There was no altar, no sermon. People shared food and spoke about their weak loss, joy, uncertainty. A child asked why they met. An elder answered, "So we remember that we belong to one another." There was no mention of God, no mention of Elias, and yet the moment felt sacred. In that moment, Elias understood the final truth he had been circling all his life. Religion had never been about rules. Rules were scaffolding, useful only until people learned to stand together without them. Money had shaped belief because survival demanded structure. But once survival was secured, meaning demanded freedom. The greatest rule Elias had changed was not written in any doctrine. It was the belief that faith must be controlled to endure. By proving that meaning could survive transparency, doubt, and choice, he dismantled the last illusion of authority. When Elias Roth eventually died, quietly and without ceremony, no institution claimed him. No doctrine canonized him. Yet his legacy endured wherever belief was practiced without fear and morality lived without transaction. The banker who changed the rules of religion did not replace God. He simply stepped aside and in doing so reminded humanity that meaning was never owned. It was shared.